Good evening. It's wonderful, isn't it, to have these nice long days where it's still light outside and it's 6 o'clock at night. I'm Dr. Jody Eastberg. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Academic Excellence and also a Professor of History here at Alverno College, and it's wonderful to see you all here tonight. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Dean Patty Varga. Were you going to say a welcome?
Just on behalf of the whole Alverno College community, we welcome you to an evening of learning and growing, and hope you all enjoy it.
So tonight's event is a joint sponsorship between the Joanne McGrath School of Nursing, of which Patty is the Dean, and the Center for Academic Excellence, and I should say the Joanne McGrath School of Nursing and Health Professions. And this partnership kind of came out of an interest in bringing Dr. Samina Molla to speak to us here at Alverno about her research into the impact of care in sexual assault victims, a partnership with our campus health and counseling services as well, and wanting to do something big for Denim Day or Sexual Assault Awareness Day, and then also an interest in bringing together the Nursing Forum. So I just want to thank the School of Nursing and the faculty and students in the School of Nursing and Health Professions for coming together with us to support this program tonight. So that's why we're doing multiple things tonight in kind of different ways. The Center for Academic Excellence supports bringing in speakers that help us to think about the ways in which academic disciplines and research can inform how we interact with the world. And so we are honored to bring Dr. Samina Molla here to speak with us. And then these forum experiences are really intended to spark a dialogue around issues that are important to our community. So hopefully we'll accomplish all of those things tonight. But this is my last moment on the stage. I'm going to introduce this evening's moderator, Melinda Hughes. And Melinda Hughes is the founding program director of the Healing Center and former chair of the Milwaukee Sexual Assault Response Team. She currently teaches in Alverno's Master of Science in Community Psychology program. Melinda is a licensed professional counselor and substance abuse counselor who draws on her experience in the related fields of domestic violence, mental health, and addiction to create integrated services for survivors of sexual trauma. So it's my great privilege to introduce Melinda, and thank you so much for helping us this evening.
Lean down. I'm really honored to be here and excited to moderate this discussion, and I can't wait to hear about Dr. Molla's findings and research. So it's great to see so many of you here today too, and I want to take a moment just to sort of celebrate and say it's an honor to be doing this, especially because this is Denim Day. It looks like some of you already know that, wearing denim, and such an important way of raising awareness in our community. And of course, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so it's very timely that we're all here together having this important discussion tonight. So, according to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the formal work on how communities respond to sexual assault traces its roots back to the 1970s. It arose from the women's rape crisis movement. And interesting for tonight's discussion, the study that led to the conceptual framework of how victim care should happen started in 1972 with the authors of that study, Ann Burgess, a psychiatric nurse, and Linda Holmstrom, a sociology professor. And they arranged to be on call at an emergency room in Boston, Massachusetts. And they wanted to study and they wanted to interview and figure out how this process works for rape victims. Our keynote presenter tonight engaged in similar work and research much more recently and will share her findings with us. It's helpful to think of the system's response to sexual assault as a four-legged stool of possibilities. Survivors may want to talk to an advocate or counselor about the assault and their options for help. They may want to go to the hospital seeking medical help or STI and pregnancy prevention options. They may want to report the assault to police. They may wish to have evidence collected from their body in what is commonly referred to as a rape kit. These professionals, advocates, law enforcement, sexual assault nurse examiners, and prosecutors make up the four legs of the sexual assault response team stool. Many SART teams have a protocol defining and guiding the practice of each system's response and the interdisciplinary cooperation amongst them. When several professionals are responding at the same time, it's important that each professional stays in her lane and does her roles and duties and not anyone else's. If the existence of SART teams, or that word is new to you, it may be helpful to put things in that historical perspective, with the first SART team formed in Kansas City, Missouri as the Metropolitan Coordinating Committee for Rape Treatment and Prevention. It was a multi-county, bi-state initiative with 67 members representing 5 counties on both sides of the Missouri state line. The year was 1973. Milwaukee has a SART team as well, and this team celebrated signing of the Milwaukee SART protocol in May of 2018. A Wisconsin law protecting the right of victims to advocate accompaniment went into effect August 1st, 2016. This law codifies and clarifies the rights of victims of sexual assault and human trafficking to have an advocate present in support at hospital medical interventions and during law enforcement interviews, prosecution interviews, and court proceedings. How each of these systems operates has a direct impact on the care and well-being of survivors. That impact can be positive, negative, or somewhere in between. Advocates, nurses, and law enforcement officers all work with survivors during an acute time of vulnerability, traumatic aftermath, pain, and confusion. How each victim is treated, how the process occurs, and how each case proceeds, if that victim chooses to report, each have an impact on the victim's overall healing process. The issue of sexual violence in our community is obviously deeply important and one that stirs emotions, rightfully so. I want to recognize that statistically, 1 in 4 women in this room and 1 in 6 men in this room would be directly impacted by sexual violence in some way, shape, or form. And everyone in this room cares deeply and significantly about this issue, or you wouldn't be here tonight. If you would like to talk to someone during or after the program, we've got Meg available, right? She's over there, raising her hand. And I also want to address the use of language, because I know that the word choice between victim and survivor is very important to some survivors and some victims. People may have preferences about word choice in this setting. In the hospital and legal investigations, the word victim is most often used, and it's really in recognition that that person has been a victim of a crime. Therefore, they have response and resources that are governed by laws and rights assigned to victims of crime. So that's why you'll hear the word victim as it pertains to those criminal legal justice and hospital interventions. We are here tonight to discuss the impact of care after sexual assault with experienced professionals from 3 of the 4 legs of that SART stool that we talked about. And each of the women present has spent considerable time working with survivors of sexual violence, and we very much appreciated them being here to share their wisdom and insights with us. We're going to start off tonight with Dr. Mola, who is here tonight to share with us her thoughts and findings on caring for victims of sexual assault and considering patient experiences of forensic intervention. And we're going to have panel discussion and Q&A to follow. Dr. Mola is an associate professor of anthropology at Marquette University. She won the 2017 Margaret Mead Award from the American Anthropology Association and the Society for Applied Anthropology for her work on sexual assault intervention in the United States, which she discusses in her book, The Violence of Care, Rape Victims, Forensic Nurses, and Sexual Assault Intervention. She is currently researching the culture of courtroom sexual assault adjudication, and she has a collaborator, Dr. Heather Havlaka. Close? Close-ish. Not close, probably. So, Dr. Mola, please, I'm turning it over to you.
I've got my jeans for denim day. Usually I get really nervous about what to wear. I've been doing this for almost 20 years and I still get nervous. So thanks for being with me here tonight. I want to thank Alverno Forum, the Center for Academic Excellence, and also the McGrath School of Nursing and Health Professions for inviting me today. And before I get started, because I'm an anthropologist, I really like to start every talk I give by inviting all of us to think a little bit about the land we're standing on, and to do a little land acknowledgement, that for most of us in the room, we're settlers here, not all of us, but most of us. And we are standing on historic lands of the Menominee, Fox, Mascouten, Sauk, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ho-Chunk nations. And there are other nations who are now part of the indigenous landscape in Wisconsin. And I want to acknowledge that and ask us to be thoughtful about that, and also ask us to really entertain the question, what would the land say about the things that we're doing on it today, as our indigenous colleagues often ask us to ask. So now I will move on to the main event. And as often happens, you give a title when you start out. And as you're piecing together how to get into your research, things evolve a little bit. So tonight I'm going to be speaking about the unintended consequences of the medicalization of sexual violence and sexual assault. It's fortuitous that I'm speaking to a room full of, diverse room full of students of different backgrounds, but I'm assuming that there's a critical mass of aspiring nursing professionals in the room. Because my work as an anthropologist, I was explaining to students earlier this evening, always takes place in the United States. Those are the exotic places I go to. I'm an institutional ethnographer, and I use the tools of field research to unpack our medical institutions and also our legal landscape. And those are the cultures that I'm interested in. And so I'm going to talk to you tonight about two projects that I've been interested in. And one of them took place in Baltimore, Maryland, and that was my research where I was the patient advocate in a rape crisis response setting, and I was also an anthropologist in that setting, and I'll tell you more about that study. And there I was really looking at the interactions between those patients and that nursing community. And I was really trying to listen hard to what the patients were telling me about what they needed and what the nurses were really driven to offer. And I'll come back to this many times. I want to emphasize the unintended nature of a lot of the consequences of the kind of institutional landscape in which these really sensitive and fraught topics are dealt with, because nobody wakes up in the morning with a hard heart, without a sense of compassion, with the sense that they're going to be cruel or ineffective when they're doing a sexual assault intervention. That is no single person on the planet's intention. But oftentimes when you are in a space with a patient and their healthcare provider, you can see that things are going very, very wrong for lots of different reasons. And so as an anthropologist, I always have tried to step back and think about how are we setting up these institutional landscapes in order to kind of give people the worst chance of being effective interventionists. So I'm going to talk about some of those pieces. And the second project that I'm working on now, which Melinda mentioned that I'm doing with a criminologist, Heather Holavka, and we went to the Milwaukee County courts and did field research. We ourselves were there for about 12 months, and we had a team of student researchers with us who sat in the courtrooms both with us. We sent them out to do pilot studies. So overall, we have about 4 years of data from Milwaukee County prosecutions. And part of what we were really interested in is after I sat in Baltimore for 4 years and watched nurses collecting forensic evidence, I was really curious what actually is done with it in the courts. Okay, and I'll tell you why as we're going. So Milwaukee and Wisconsin and Baltimore, Maryland are really interesting cities to contrast for lots of different reasons. So I'm going to kind of tack back and forth between those two projects. I'll start a little bit more with the clinical context. And maybe one of the things we can think about is, I think a lot of social scientists, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here, they really like to count things and enumerate things, right? And that's a really important thing to do. And I read all of that research, but I'm not a bean counter. I'm a storyteller, and I'm a field worker. And part of what I do is figure out, okay, this is what the numbers say, but what's actually going on the ground, right? Because this is where our policy interventions can be really thoughtfully informed. But it is also one of those spaces where it's really easy to despair, because sometimes you see things and you start to think, how am I going to undo this? So tonight I'm going to ask you or invite you to think with me really about some of these big picture questions, because I think that all of us are well-intentioned and compassionate, and want to listen and want to respond effectively when someone discloses that they have experienced sexual violence, right? If it hasn't happened to you already, in terms of someone in your network coming forward, the chances are that someone will have reached out to you at some point, right? And the other piece of it is, I'm going to be talking about the professionals and the experts who do this work, but most of the time, people reach out to their peers. They're not ever going to end up with a therapist or in a courtroom or in front of a police officer or with a rape crisis advocate. They're going to come to a friend or a trusted kinsman, right? So you are the most important form of sexual assault response out there. It's really community, okay? And I want to say that because I think that we love our institutional responses in the US. We resource them, not enough, but we spend millions and millions of dollars, right? And for a lot of sexual assault survivors navigating these systems, sometimes it feels like if you don't make an official report, it wasn't really a big deal, or it didn't really happen, right? This is something that patients would tell me all the time in the ER. Why did they call? They know that it's going to be a really hard time. But, you know, here we go. I just need my family to believe me that this really happened, right? And that breaks my heart, because I think the idea that people are accessing these institutions in order to legitimize their experiences to their community is really problematic. And there's something we can do about that tomorrow, okay? Which is that when someone comes forward, you can be supportive and you can reflect their feelings and you can withdraw your judgment and just say, what do you need? What do you need from me, right? So I want to try to diminish a little bit the importance of these institutional pieces, because they're important and they matter, but the fact is most survivors will never access these systems, okay? They will come to you. What am I talking about when I talk about the medicalization of sexual violence, okay? Has not always been the case that we have had specialized health professionals who know how to respond to people who are crime victims or people who are victims of sexual assault. This is really a very recent development. It sort of parallels the development of the rape crisis center response and advocacy response, where in the 1970s and then really in the 80s, you actually start to see in the US nurses seeking specialized training as what's often called a SANE nurse or sexual assault nurse examiner. In Maryland, they're sometimes called FNEs, forensic nurse examiner, and the difference is for the forensic nurse, the scope of practice might be a little bit bigger. So you're not just working with sexual assault survivors, you're actually also potentially working with other kinds of crime victims, or also potential defendants, right? What often gets parsed as the rape kit, which is how we all refer to it, but I think that even in that really pat description of it, right? There tends to be an oversimplification, is commonly medical legal sexual assault examination. And what you see here are some of the envelopes that accompany the kit that gets used in Maryland, which has over 27 steps. And most of those steps, it's different from state to state. This is why there's lots for anthropologists to do in the U.S. We're very, very provincial. So we have different criminal statutes in every state. And so that means that every state is going to be seeking slightly different evidence. And so the crime labs in each state create slightly different kits, right? And the forensic nurses do get a lot of training and expertise in working with these materials, right? But in Baltimore, Maryland, when I was doing my field research, what often would happen is that the evidence part of the case really started to take over the care part, right? Now, nursing is this incredibly amazing field in the sense that nurses are really trained to do a holistic intervention, right? The scope of practice can be really, really wide. But in a place where the emergency room is getting really, really busy, these patients are, frankly, sometimes not the most sympathetic patients. I know that's shocking, but I'll talk a little bit more about what that's like when you're an overworked and very tired and very stressed out medical professional, and you're like, oh, I have to do another one of these cases, and I really want to go home, because frequently there aren't enough of the nurses, right? Structurally, because a lot of these programs are really understaffed, nurses burn out, right? They're not well compensated nationally for this kind of labor. What ends up happening sometimes is just a rush, right? Let me just rush through these evidence collection steps. And it turns out patients can tell when you're doing that. And that's not the ideal, and there are many nurses who don't practice in that particular way. But, again, if we think about unintended consequences, if I don't fully resource these practices, it's going to create a condition under which it increases the stress for the personnel in the clinical setting, and they're just not at their best, right? So one of the things that I talk about in my research is sometimes when I was in there, I would have this really strange thought as an anthropologist, which was, who is the patient here, right? Is it the crime victim who's come in asking for care and investigation, or are we really preserving DNA, right? And the kinds of things that I would see are cases where we would just spend so much time in pursuit of DNA that maybe things were going more slowly, for example, than the patient actually wanted them to, right? And so there's this tension that happens as well in terms of standards of consent, because we're supposed to use really high standards of consent in these clinical interactions. And the other piece of it is that we're really worried about preserving evidence. And so in the emergency room where I was working, it was the practice to keep the temperature of the SANE suite in which these exams were taking place as low as possible, right? It was a really cold place. And some of the nurses, again, right, this isn't because people are cruel, they would be very rushed. So they might not think to grab an extra blanket to put over this patient. And so you're working with a patient who's shivering and who's asking you, is there any way we can get it warmer in here, right? But the nurse is frantically working to preserve this evidence, which she thinks is really, really critical to this criminal justice prosecution, right? And the thing that we're sacrificing is the comfort of the patient, okay? And there are many, many examples like that. And so this is a question, again, which, if you ask any health professional, who's your patient, they're going to be like, this victim is my patient. But if I put her in a setting in which she's really feeling quite stressed out about what she might have access to, it might change the focus there, right? So institutionally, oftentimes the care is going into the evidence and not into the patient, right? Now Baltimore, I don't know if any of you guys have ever traveled there, is 60% African American and has overwhelmingly white nursing staff in the sexual assault treatment center, okay? And of course, when I was doing my field research, no one wants to overtly discuss race, right? Everyone has these very veiled ways of thinking about those identities and how they rub up against each other. And if you know anything about Baltimore, there's a big medical school there, Johns Hopkins University. And Johns Hopkins University is, sometimes I like to say, it's my alma mater, that's where I did my doctoral work, but it's also like every glorious and shameful chapter in the history of medicine has probably like walked through Johns Hopkins, right? So they processed Tuskegee syphilis data there. There have been scandalous lead studies leading to poisoning of children. There have been scandalous asthma trials, right? The HeLa cell line, right, also passed through Johns Hopkins, so they were implicated in kind of the theft of that legacy. And they have a really contentious relationship with the local community, right, who really see themselves as having been exploited as the kind of subject of all this health-related research, right? So you can imagine that people are not so excited about doctors and nurses there. And this dribbles into a lot of healthcare practice. So oftentimes, right, we want to do our best, we want to be efficient, but we also have all of these ideas about what kinds of patient communities come to us with different issues. Sometimes these kind of get stacked under the subheading of compliance. Certain kinds of communities are less compliant patients than others, right? And one of the kind of tensions in the sexual assault forensic intervention is a lot of people approach the intervention with this notion that it's the criminal justice piece that makes the care part tricky. But I like to remind people that medicine in the US, right, and nursing practice also has a really tricky history and social relationship to the many communities that make up our different localities, right? And so sometimes those tensions, and particularly racial tensions, are actually coming in because as a nurse, you have been oriented to think of Black patients in particular as resistant to certain kinds of care, right? And so this is also very problematic because, again, we're not being direct. So what I would witness as the rape crisis advocate was oftentimes a point where I could see the nurse really getting frustrated with the patient, and then she would leave the room, and the patient would turn to me and ask me, why doesn't she like me? Is it because I'm Black, right? And they would pick up on it right away, right? Some tension. So, it's very interesting being the person in the middle of that. And your cues as a rape crisis advocate, I think, kind of fall away because in a sense of wanting to reflect the person's feelings, right? It felt a little bit like gaslighting. Well, do you think that she doesn't like you because she's Black? So I would have these really tricky conversations with patients because I wanted to honor the experiences they were having. And then I would work with the nurses later so that we could unpack some of those dynamics as well, right? So I am giving you a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar that we mostly associate with the concept of intersectionality and particularly intersectional feminism. And she's articulated it in this idea of intersectionality in two major articles. But the second article, Mapping the Margins, is actually her analysis of how Black women navigate systems of criminal justice response in cases of sexual assault and domestic violence, right? Where she really maps out not just the idea of the failure of those systems for women experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault, but what it means to navigate those systems as a Black woman, where those are systems that have criminalized you and the communities that you come from that doubt you, right? And to think again about how we can actually reproduce an intersectional analysis in this kind of anthropological work, right? And I'm not going to give you a big lecture on intersectionality, but sometimes we're kind of taught to think of intersectionality as like all those lists of identities that we carry around, right? I'm a woman, I'm the child of undocumented parents, I'm a Muslim American, right? I'm an English speaker, I speak a couple of other languages, I'm a 40-something-year-old woman, right? And we almost think of those things as like different variables, but what Crenshaw really cautions us about is the fact that I'm always all of those things. Always, right? This isn't just a bunch of identity characteristics. So I think a really productive way to think about intersectionality is to ask the question, what are the conditions of liberating each and every person, right? So if sexual assault intervention is a project not just of healing, but of liberation, what would it mean to meet each patient where all of her needs are, right? I think that's a really hard question to ask. And it's one that I think really quickly we start to think about, maybe some of these institutions can serve particular purposes, right? And you'll see where I'm heading in a little while. But, are they really going to liberate us? And particularly when we ask Black women and Latina women and undocumented women and Native women to navigate these systems, right? These are systems that have really long histories of contentious relationships with all of those communities, and they bring that with them, even when the work is the noble work of sexual assault intervention. That becomes much more obvious when I get into the courtroom and I'm sitting there as a feminist anthropologist thinking about the politics of incarceration in the state of Wisconsin, okay? I'll just point to a couple of kind of historical moments again, because I think this is bigger than a single nurse. It's bigger than a single practice. In 2006, under the Clinton administration, right, these are good things, we had policy implementation of the Violence Against Women Act really go into effect, which meant that police could no longer be the gatekeepers of sexual assault forensic examination. And that was a really important change. It meant that patients could choose for themselves whether or not they wanted to have access to this examination, right? But it also starts to kick up the number of exams we're doing, right? And it produces a whole bunch of other unintended consequences because in theory, there's now no barrier to patients accessing the sexual assault examination, right? So we're going to be doing more of them and needing more of them, right? But what actually happens afterwards? And this is why, after spending 4 years in the emergency room, now here in Milwaukee, I've been spending all this time in the courts. And lo and behold, blessed are the bean counters, what they tell us about forensic evidence nationally, except for Michigan, and we don't really know what's going on in Michigan or why it's different, but Michigan's special. But every other state where they've looked at the inclusion of forensic evidence in all violent crimes, murder, robbery, and battery cases and sexual assault, it turns out to have nothing to do with the outcome of the case, which is not what we thought was going to happen, right? So I'm a process person and I'm wondering why? Why? What's going on, right? The why isn't so difficult. The why has a lot to do with the fact that, and we all know this, right? that most sexual assaults involve people who know each other. We don't really have a lot of cases where we can't identify a perpetrator. There are very few cases with perpetrators who are unidentified, right? So we are processing DNA where most of the time we already have an identification, right? And so what do the defense attorneys say if there is evidence of DNA that is produced during an exam, which is pretty rare, right? Is it's consensual. Yes, it was consensual sex, right? So the jury is like, okay, there's DNA, but now he's saying it's consensual. And DNA is really the only scientifically rigorous piece of evidence that really comes out of those forensic interventions thus far. So a lot of the different types of wound analysis can really be challenged and often are by defense. A lot of times there just is no forensic evidence. The prosecutors here in Milwaukee love it when there is some forensic evidence because they can talk about how rare it is that they actually found something, right? And that's what they do in court. But a lot of times when we're talking about very young survivors or reporters who are coming in, it's weeks or days or months, right, after something terrible has happened to them, and they've worked up the courage to reach out to somebody. And after a certain window, it keeps getting revised a little longer, right, as the science gets better. We don't really do forensic intervention anymore, which makes a lot of sense, right? And most victims of sexual violence are very young, right? They're under 30 for sure, and we know that 18 to 24 is a really critical time period, and people have a lot of things going on in their lives. We see a lot of children in the Milwaukee County court system. The youngest person I've seen testify was 4 years old, which shocked me because in other states that wouldn't have happened in open court. I kind of felt like I shouldn't have been there. And the oldest has been in her 80s. So there's a lot of reasons why the evidence doesn't actually answer the questions we want it to. And in my opinion, it also creates this idea that we shouldn't trust testimony. And testimony is the most important evidence, right? Even of expert witnesses like forensic nurses, it's actually their fact testimony about what they did during an examination. I think that's very compelling to the jury. So those are some of the reasons why we kind of really put this emphasis on solving the sexual assault investigations via forensic evidence, but sort of end up then being shocked by why this isn't having an impact on anything. I'll skip the CSI effect stuff, but basically jurors are as likely to be excited about forensic evidence as they are to be skeptical about it. That's what TV and newspapers teach you about forensic evidence. And the other outcome of thinking about this kind of medical approach is that the trial then becomes a space where something else is happening. We're telling particular stories about sexual violence and sexual assault, okay? And so those are stories where we're sort of saying we need this kind of expert witness because a woman's word, and it's mostly women, but there's a small handful of men, right? I think in 640 appearances, I saw maybe 6 men, and the rest of them were all women. But we're telling this particular kind of a story, and I will kind of rush through this little piece of it. But we tell really, really interesting stories about women's bodies in court. And some of it is to break down certain stereotypes, but some of it also feeds into ideas of what women should all be doing with their bodies. So this is a little bit, this is as colorful as it's going to get, but these are body maps, right? So we really sanitize women's bodies when we show them to people in court. They don't come with complicated actual flesh. They don't come with complicated stories. And then these are actual quotations from nurses who've testified in court talking about women's genital anatomy. And the language that they use is they'll say, okay, you know, women's bodies are made to have sexual assault, or have sexual intercourse often, excuse me. They're very lubricated, they're very stretchy. They're similar to the membrane of the mouth, which is a mucous membrane. They're like a scrunchie, that's one of my favorites. Able to accommodate something the size of a watermelon. Now we're talking about birth, right? So every woman's body is this heteronormative, right, potentially maternal body, and it's fantastic for people who do walk that path, but not every body that comes through that court is a heteronormative maternal body, right? There are queer women, there are women who haven't given birth, there are lots of different things going on, and all those things matter in terms of the stories that we tell. So that is one of the reasons why we've been really paying close attention to what gets said in those cases. So I'll leave it there. And I will, again say that it's really important that we do respond to sexual assault in a compassionate and professional manner, that we center the needs of victims when they're participating in these interventions. But I also want to point out that response is not prevention. So when we are saying, hey, we have a rape kit backlog and we need to solve it. That, those kits shouldn't be sitting on a shelf, right? Well, maybe the ones that involve two acquaintances who know each other, maybe it's okay if those sit on the shelf, right? Because we are able to identify somebody. Maybe we should prioritize something else. And prevention, I think, is a really important, imperative piece. And when I say that response is not prevention, what I mean is you talk to criminologists, incarceration does not deter sexual violence, okay? There's always someone else, somewhere else. So it really is a function of education and creating a more kind of just society and raising our young men and women with age-appropriate kind of orientations to bodily autonomy and consent. And I will leave you with this pithy little piece. As somebody who has moved here from Washington, D.C. for 11 years and observed the intense over-policing and incarceration and witnessed in the courtrooms the over-policing and incarceration, particularly of black sex offenders, right? With whom I am not sympathetic in the sense of the violence that they have done most of the time to black women, which needs to be taken really seriously. The number of times that white men are held accountable for the exact same crime has just become really, really troubling. And so that's something that my partner and I will be analyzing, right? Because I think when we started out this project, we have been really concerned that incarceration is not the path necessarily to a more just, and by just for me I mean a society without sexual violence, right? That's what justice looks like to me. But having done the research, it's really caused me to question what we're doing in those courtrooms, and to really think about heeding the wants and desires of survivors when they come to us and ask us for help. So thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to invite up our other two panelists. Let me introduce them to you now. Lacey Euler is a licensed professional counselor, currently serving as a part-time counselor at Alverno College. She previously worked at the Women's Center in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and at the Sexual Assault Treatment Center in Milwaukee, where she provided advocacy and counseling to adult and child survivors of sexual assault and abuse. She has served on the Waukesha County's Coordinated Community Response Team, Committee, whatever, right? Close, all the above, and the Sexual Assault Response Teams. And she has led community and volunteer trainings on trauma-informed practices. So, Lacey, come on up. I guess we're gonna sit and then talk, okay? All right. And also Michelle Zapinski, a certified psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner who practices at Aurora Behavioral Health Center and Aurora Healing and Advocacy Services. She is a member of the Alverno College nursing faculty. Michelle received additional training as a sexual assault nurse examiner to treat both pediatric and adult survivors of sexual assault. She has training in domestic and intimate partner violence, trauma assessment and strangulation, and Michelle has served as an expert witness for strangulation and sexual assault related court cases in Milwaukee County. Come on up, Michelle. All right. So we've asked them to each share their thoughts and ideas about their role, what they're trying to accomplish, and how they do that particular sensitive work. Either one of whoever wants to kick it off. Make sure microphones are on so everybody can hear.
Not my teacher voice.
And after we hear from our two panelists, then we're going to open it up to some Q&A from you as well. Okay?
All right. Hi, my name is Michelle. I just wanted to come and thanks everybody for coming tonight and to being part of this very important day. If anybody doesn't know what Denim Day is, this is our 20th anniversary of celebrating Denim Day. It goes back to a 1992 court case in Rome, Italy, where a 45-year-old driving instructor sexually assaulted his 18-year-old student. She ended up going home, telling her parents. Initially, he was only charged with indecent exposure, and the case was dropped. And she appealed, and then he ended up getting convicted of rape. And after it went to the Supreme Court, the charges were ultimately overturned due to the fact that she was wearing tight jeans. So according to the court officials, because her jeans were so tight, she would have had to somehow help assist him to take those off in order for the assault to happen, therefore making it consensual. So thank you for everybody who's wearing jeans today. People ask me a lot, what do I do as a forensic nurse? Kind of the basic standard definition that I give a lot in the courtroom is that we are a registered or an advanced practice nurse that receives specialized training and education as far as how to do forensic exams and evidence collection. For me, it was something that I took part with the Wisconsin Department of Justice. My catalyst for doing this, I was an ICU nurse at a critical care access hospital up in northern Wisconsin. And a young girl was 21 years old, got brought in, and she had been both physically and sexually abused. And nobody in that county knew how to do a kit, nor was there anybody available. So on top of that, there's a police officer who his heart went out to her and said, I will take her to the nearest program, which was in Green Bay. And it was an hour ride, and she had to ride in the back of a cop car with somebody. It was safe, but I mean, could you imagine if you didn't do anything wrong and had to sit in the back of a police car? And took her to get the nearest care for her. And that was my call to say, what do I have to do in order to be able to do this? And so I took a 40-hour, it was a 1-week-long training up in, I think I was up around the Wausau area. Then took another week-long training for pediatric. I had to go to Madison at the UW system, where they actually brought live medical models in to learn how to do the pelvic exams, evidence collection, using dyes, using the specialized camera, using all of those things. And what else have I done? Then I also have training for strangulation. I went to San Diego Strangulation Institute to learn to do that. The strangulation is a strong component in a lot of the sexual assaults that I see. We work, Aurora Sinai is the largest sexual assault treatment center in the state of Wisconsin. We average about 3 to 5 patients every single day. The record of one day that I worked was 14 patients in one day. It is not uncommon to see more than 5 patients in a day. I think that forensic nursing is something that most of the nursing, I know there's a lot of nursing students that are here. It's a nice blend of science and compassion. Every nursing student, every person in this room will come across somebody that has experienced trauma. And I think in my role, I'm very blessed to work with a lot of community advocates. I work with advocates that are with the patient so that I can provide care to the patient. So if I get paged in to see if I have a patient, I come in and I, first of all, will explain that everything that they want or need done, everything is their choice. I think that's the most important thing, regardless. Everything is patient-centered and compassionate care. I have women who, and men, actually my first patient as a SANE nurse was a male patient, a 15-year-old male patient. So I offer services. I say that we can do evidence collection. I do not focus on evidence collection. I want to see where this patient is at. How comfortable are you? Have you eaten? Do you need to go to the bathroom? You know, as much as it pains for me to say that sexual assault does not kill you, it doesn't. Medical needs are taken care of first. I don't touch that patient until they were medically cleared. So, first steps of the process, we ask them what they want: evidence collection, focused physical exam, a full head-to-toe exam, medications, STD prophylaxis, kind of goes on from there, and then I can go further down the road and tell you more about what I do. Sorry about my crappy voice, too.
Hi, thanks to everyone for being here. So I'm giving the perspective of the victim advocate's role. So the role of an advocate is specifically to support the victim and assist in that person's healing journey. The sole purpose of an advocate is to be there to serve the victim. The main thing that an advocate will do is provide information and options available to that victim, and supporting the victim in whatever his or her decision is. It's not to guide the person, it's not to necessarily provide recommendations, it's to provide that information, provide non-judgmental support, and support that person in whatever they decide to do. The belief is really that the victim knows his or herself best. I'm a stranger, so I may have some beliefs about how this might go for the person, but I need to trust that person to make their own decisions. Victim advocates can work in a variety of settings. The most common setting is like a community-based support social service agency or a not-for-profit agency. Advocates often work either in person, individually with victims or survivors, or on hotlines or text lines. Other settings where victim advocates can work is within the criminal justice system. So for instance, police departments, the DA's office, probation or parole, within the jail system, within the hospital or various healthcare systems, which is what we're focusing on tonight. Advocates can also work in educational institutions. So for instance, larger college and universities often have paid staff to provide victim advocacy services, because we know, as Samina mentioned, that individuals ages 18 to 24 are a very common age to experience sexual violence. So college campuses are trying more and more to equip that advocacy end for students who are seeking care and support from their university or college. So advocates can provide support both directly to a victim or survivor and also provide systemic advocacy where they're addressing the macro or the systems that can impact survivors. For today's little introduction, I'm going to focus specifically on that individual advocacy. Also note, although tonight we're talking specifically about that medical intervention, is that advocates are available to survivors at whatever stage in the healing journey they seek out for support. So it could be immediately after the support, it could be years, it could be decades after that crime had taken place. And it's important to remember that very few survivors will ever report their assault to law enforcement or present at a medical facility. So we need to make sure that these advocacy and support services are available whenever a person might need them. So what are the most common roles of an advocate? The main role is to provide crisis intervention and emotional support. Oftentimes individuals are going to be presenting while they're in the hospital or with a police officer or, you know, here to school and be alone. So to be able to have a support person there, just another person to lean on and provide resources. We had mentioned how cold the exam rooms can be. One of the first things I do, or when I responded at the hospital, was to offer, do they need a blanket? Do they need a sandwich? Do they need a juice box? Just something to bring that person down and help them feel safe and supported. Provide information, resources, and referrals. Again, really supporting that person so that he or she knows what are all the options available. One of the most impactful things that advocates can do is provide information about what are common trauma reactions and to normalize the experience of what that person is going through. For instance, talking about, why can't I remember what happened? What's going on with that? I've just talked to 4 different people. I can't even remember what's going on. So again, providing that information and normalizing about what that person is experiencing. Advocates can provide short and long-term problem solving with a person. For instance, when folks are presenting at the hospital, they may have their kids with them. What am I supposed to do? I want to receive medical care, but I don't have anybody to watch my kids. Or transportation options. I missed work today. How do I handle that? So again, kind of short term, what is the immediate need of this person and how can I assist them? Safety planning. We mentioned that most assaults are committed by someone known to the victim. How can we work with that survivor to make sure that he or she is safe? Does that include contacting law enforcement to obtain a restraining order? Does it not? Working with that person to make sure that he or she does have a safe place to go. It can include accompaniment, whether that's to a hospital, interviews with police, again with the DA's office, prosecution, and then counseling and case management. But I say that with a caveat because most advocates are not therapists. A majority of them are volunteers. So it's really being aware of what is my role and providing that support, and if an individual needs long-term care, handing that off to the most appropriate provider. I just happen to be a therapist, but again, most are not, and most are volunteers that have a crisis phone that rings at their house in the middle of the night, that they're there to provide support to survivors. So what does good advocacy look like? It's a lot of listening, okay? It's taking that time to really connect with the person and to understand that each person's experience is unique to them. You're going to tailor the care and the need to that particular person. So if you've been listening well, you're going to be able to do that. Advocacy needs to be culturally competent. So again, understanding how a person's various roles, identities, culture is going to impact his or her experience. A common thing to be culturally competent is, do you have interpreters available for the person's native language? You also want to make sure that your services are accessible. So for instance, if a person has a disability, making sure that those services are accommodating to meet the needs of that particular person. And you're also watching for nonverbals. So does the person seem to fully understand what his or her options are? So for instance, when we're assisting in a medical intervention, Michelle's doing her darndest to really break this down and describe piece by piece by piece what is available for this person. And sometimes we just have to kind of look, is this person, she's nodding, but is she really, is she really getting it? And how can we work together to make sure she does have informed consent and she is truly understanding what's going on? So what are the benefits of having a victim advocate? There is limited research, unfortunately, on this topic. One of the main researchers is Rebecca Campbell out of the Michigan State University. And what her research tells us is that advocacy services do facilitate recovery and they increase victims' access to other services, but she really wanted to know why. Okay, what is it about having an advocate present that increases those outcomes? And what she's found is that victims who work with an advocate seem to be less likely to blame themselves for the assault. That is super, super common, that on some level survivors believe on some level that what happened to them was their fault. But when they have access to an advocate, that belief goes down, which means they're more likely to seek assistance from other community responses. Once they're accessing more community resources, they're accessing more professional support and tend to have better recovery outcomes. So we believe advocates are very important.
All right. So as I was listening to you all, each of you sharing your thoughts, I was struck by, kind of like, how did we get to this moment? And I think we all probably recognize that we're in a moment right now that will be a totally different conversation in 20 years, or even 5 years, 10 years. But I think about when that rape crisis movement was getting started and getting going. It used to just be, if you were sexually assaulted, you just showed up at someone's house or a friend, or never told anybody at all, right? And then we started with this idea of talking to survivors about what do you need to happen. And people who decide to report are usually talk to me about, sometimes it's I want justice, but that's actually the least common reason that survivors tell me that they want to report. Number one is, I don't want this to happen to someone else. Even in that crisis moment, to have that sort of altruism, really, that I'm willing to put myself through what everybody expects to be a pretty difficult process in a very cold room. Always medical rooms are so chilly. Because they don't want this person to keep hurting other people in the community. And the other, number two has always been, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that person's going to come back for me again, or they know where I live, or they know what I look like, or they took my driver's license. They know, as you said, they know that person, usually. So I'm struck by the fact that we started really honing in on this medical legal response to counteract that whole defense of it didn't happen. She made it up. She's crazy, right? So we thought, if we can get evidence, if we can get DNA, right, then we'll show them, we'll be able to prove that it happened. And we really put a lot of stock in that if we could get that all documented really thoroughly and by professionals who were pretty objective, that we would win these court cases and hold people responsible and accountable. And about the second we started really having DNA be recognized and understood, and people were starting to get, okay, there's DNA, then it was immediately portrayed as consensual. So it doesn't even matter. We've had cases that were complete, absolute strangers, and they just make it up and say, oh yeah, we met at a bar, we've hung out, we were partying together, like it was all consensual. So all the evidence in the world kind of doesn't help on that particular case. And I think we haven't gotten there yet where we understand how to overcome victim blaming and the myths and stereotypes that people still unfortunately hold about sexual violence and people who are sexually assaulted. While you guys share your thoughts about that, each of you take a couple seconds to do that. And then are we collecting cards? We've got some? Some? Oh, okay. So we're also going to be collecting questions. So there's little note cards. right? And you're going to be scooting around, somebody's going to be scooting around. So I want you to do a little preparatory question writing while we get some thoughts on that large question.
Okay, I can take a stab at what I've seen that's really important that actually happens in the courtroom, because it's true what you're saying, that even in extremely egregious, violent assaults that involve strangers, we'll see some defense of consent. And they're very racialized narratives here in Milwaukee County. And I'll share one of the most common ones with you, which it's very offensive. I'm going to try to frame it in that way. In that, oftentimes, with many of the African American women who are victims in these cases, the defense narrative around stranger assaults is that this is in fact transactional sex, that it's a sex work engagement gone wrong. I've seen it many, many times, and it upsets the prosecutors, and it's upsetting to hear. And the thing that I found confounding, first of all, is that sex workers can also be victims of sexual violence. So, that, let's kind of bracket that. But secondly, that they'll say this about anyone regardless of her professional status. So we've seen it work with professional middle-class victims, right? So, but it was transactional sex, but there was a gun, but, and all of these things. So this part of it is true, right? Those consent defenses are really, really common, and by the time you see them adjudicated, it's because either someone has no choice or they really think they have a good chance of proving that. But the second piece of it is, forensic nursing is very important. And forensic nurses do a really important thing when cases do go to trial, which is that they explain why there are no injuries, right? Like all that language that I was showing you is the nurse basically educating the jury about the fact that wounds are really rare, right? For all kinds of reasons, including, some of the reasons that are given, that tissue really heals really quickly. So some of what's happening during the trial is actually kind of re-education and explaining the culture of evidence. And some of it is reinforcing this sort of idea that, we need the forensic examination to prove that the victim was committed to telling the truth. And that's what, there's a political scientist, Rose Corrigan, has published an article where she says the forensic examination is like the new trial by ordeal, that this is what the system is looking for, right? The prosecutors want to know that the victim is committed. The forensic nurse is going to treat every patient who comes in, regardless of whether she says she's going to move ahead with criminal justice or not, right? The forensic nurses are going to do the work that they have to do. They're going to put that care first. But the system might need that kit more than the victim does. And that might be what's going on in Michigan, right? Because there is some sense that in Michigan, the outcomes of these trials are tied to the inclusion of forensic evidence, but it is the only state in which that is happening right now. But I think that's changing too. I think the science is changing all the time. And so we might reach a point where we do have evidence that's really useful. And I think it's that hope that kind of keeps people going back. But for now, we really need to believe people's testimony. And that's what I say is testimony is evidence, right? People's stories are the most important. And that's what's predictive, is how compelling the testimony is. Right.
And I think it brings it back to that issue of prevention, right? So if this case does make it all the way to a jury trial, which is very, very rare, but if it does, we have 12 jurors who have been brought up in a society of victim blaming. So they're coming in with their own bias, their own traumas, and how does that influence their view of the testimony, of the evidence. So this is work that needs to be done on a prevention base to educate folks once it gets to that point.
And I think one of the key pieces that I find too is how it works in Milwaukee when a sexual assault happens. It gets reported to the district that it happens in first. So my patient has to tell their story and report everything, and then even come in to see me. And then if it's deemed okay by the district, then they'll call sensitive crimes. So then sensitive crimes will come and interview them a second time. So again, we're going through having to tell your story numerous times, re-traumatizing every single time. And I can tell you so many times where I've had police officers, district, and even special or sensitive crimes detectives that'll ask me, well, what do you think? Do you think they knew each other? I'm getting a different story from somebody else. I mean, the whole victim blaming thing can even come onto us who are here to serve and protect and take care of these, the victims. So I think it's, again, the prevention thing that you were saying. I've seen it all across the board, so.
Okay, there's some really great questions up here that you have turned in, and I am going to try to get us through as many of them as possible. So I'm going to ask panelists, like, if it's a one word, let's take one. If it's a couple sentences, let's keep it as short as possible, right? So this one is for Samina. When you talk to the nurses about the patient's concern that they had, about their demeanor, how did they respond? Did they reflect upon that and like learn from that feedback?
Absolutely. And I wouldn't do it without a relationship there. I mean, these are really well-educated, compassionate people. This is not intentional behavior, right? And I also think that they enjoyed having someone to listen to, because oftentimes these are really long days, right? 5 patients in a day, 14 patients in a day, that's too much. So yeah, they evolve and change all of the time. But then some of them burned out in 3 years, and I'd have a new crop in, and here we go again.
And Michelle, what happens if you get evidence collected and then change your mind about going forward and pressing charges?
How it works for us is that even if we have a patients that'll come in and they're undecided. So what happens, but they might want to think about it or whatever. I will always do whatever the patient wants. We collect the evidence. If it's undecided, we have a chain of command or we give it to our loss prevention. And if it's something that they want to report, it stays there for X amount of time. If they're undecided right off the bat, they don't know if they want law enforcement involved or anything, we immediately send it to the state crime lab. And they hold that just under 10 years. So they have up to 10 years to decide whether or not they can report it or they will report it. If that happens, let's say a year later they decide, I'm ready to tell my story, I want to go forward, then it goes to the police office or the district where the assault happened. They then request the information or pass it to the crime lab. They'll process the kit. So that's how it works.
Okay. And for whoever feels like they might have knowledge based in this, any data about sexual violence or cultural barriers in the Latinx community? Cultural barriers to reporting or cultural barriers to talking about it, I'm assuming?
I mean, there's really good research that shows not just for sexual assault, but also domestic violence, that your documentation status, or even being part of a mixed status family, like maybe you're a citizen, but someone in your family isn't, is a barrier to reporting. Because at this point, the law of the land is really uneven. So that's one of the major issues. Our court system's pretty good about translation, but sometimes or interpreters, Spanish to English, so language can also be an issue. I'm not sure how it works at the hospital, though.
We always have interpreters.
live interpreters most of the time. We have live interpreters, and if we can't, we have a video. Sorry.
We have a video, it's called Marty, a video interface, so it has every language you can think of, and it's almost like FaceTime. Like, we call up and an operator will come up and we'll say what language, and we can do our forensic interview that way.
So, okay. So video option, if not an in-person
Correct.
option?
Correct.
Obviously, the in-person would be preferable, but,
Correct.
right? Okay. Lacey, how does, generally at like sexual assault treatment center, how does one get in contact with an advocate? Like, how does that process happen where the advocate's brought on board?
Well, in my experience, well, the first thing folks often do is call the hotline, which we do have a table of resources out in the hallway, so if anyone needs access to a 24/7 hotline. But when individuals present at Aurora, an advocate is paid. So if it's during the day, staff are available and they walk down to the emergency department. After hours, holidays, weekends, an advocate or a crisis counselor is paged and brought in to meet with the victim. Previously, victims were asked if they would like an advocate, and what we were finding is that they often say no. For many reasons, they want to handle it themselves, they don't want to be a burden on the system, things of that nature. So now we just show up, and they have to opt out of services. And again, most people say yes, once they get a chance to meet us and see that we're there to provide help and support. Whereas previously, if you give them the option, most will say no.
Yeah. And they don't want to drag you out of bed at 3 in the morning to say, oh yeah, bring her in, right? Okay, here's a quick one. How often does rape result in pregnancy among female victims? Just ballpark. Any idea?
Latest research that I've shown, if unprotected, is ranging anywhere between 1% to 5%, is what I've seen.
I was just going to say
From
more
stats,
often than
yeah.
you think. Like,
Right.
I think people think that you can't get pregnant if it's a rape.
Right.
I think a lawmaker even said that, which wasn't accurate.
And that's one of the options for individuals that present for medical care is they are offered prophylactics to prevent, or what's the correct term for that?
Yeah,
Prophylaxis.
emergency contraception, or if it's within a certain hour, of, sorry, I hate microphones. If it's within the 72 hours of the incident occurring.
Okay. We've got a couple questions on what are the resources that are out there for survivors who the assault wasn't recent, and those are probably also on the table, right, out there? So, I mean, Healing Center seems like a good first call.
Yeah, so I wish I should know it off the top of my head, but there's a 24/7 hotline here in Milwaukee that's staffed by advocates around the clock, and that's a great first call for support. They can talk about what their particular services are for counseling, support groups, all that kind of stuff. If folks want to use their insurance, they can talk about what are some local providers that are specialized in sexual assault care. So I think that hotline would be the best first call for support.
Yeah, I might be biased about the Healing Center since I used to work there, but it is a great place. Okay. How can people who are interested in becoming patient advocates get involved?
So if you call Aurora Sinai or Aurora Healing and Advocacy, our general number, we do have Nikki Glazer, who's the manager of Aurora Healing, and she coordinates volunteer training. So we do have people that come in to volunteer just to answer the phones, answer our hotline, and then we also do advocacy training as well.
And if any of you live outside of Milwaukee County, for advocates, you need to be able to respond, I want to say within 60 minutes of receiving your page. So if you don't live close, you could research what advocacy agencies are closer to your home. And most of those agencies provide free training for individuals that want to commit to be an advocate. So for Waukesha County, it would be the Waukesha Women's Center. There's one in Jefferson County. We're seeing Kenosha counties. So you could look up which agency is closest to where you live.
There's also a statewide coalition, WCASA is the acronym, Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and they have a find a program or find help kind of button on there where you can look up sexual assault response programs anywhere in the state. So if you're talking to a friend or someone that is somewhere completely else and you don't know what the resources are in that area, you can use that website, or they can use that website to find the sexual assault program essentially in their area. All right, this is sort of a bigger picture question. Do you think the Me Too movement has brought more attention / awareness to sexual assault? And I'm going to tail hook on there. And is it good attention, or are there difficulties? Anybody? Can you take that one?
I think it's good attention, right? I think the first barrier is that these are really hard conversations to have. I like to point out to my students at Marquette that we're not good at talking about healthy sexuality and sexual relationships as a culture. So, it's no wonder that the violent, coercive, and unhealthy is even more difficult. And so in the sense that there's now a space, and that Tarana Burke has been doing that work, and there's a hashtag attached to it, like, those conversations are good. I think the worry is that you have to be a famous person to have a story that matters, right? For me, I don't care how famous you are or not famous, like, every story matters. And I do worry about, does Me Too mean we're going to suddenly rush to fortify the response piece of it, or does Me Too mean we're going to really drill down on the prevention side? So, and then I've been to a lot of conferences where, it's always the man in the front row raises his hand and he's like, well, doesn't Me Too make it really hard? Like, aren't the men scared now to flirt? And I usually respond by, the men are scared to flirt. The women are being hurt. They're suffering. They're being violated, and they're violent. So if you're a little nervous, I think I'm okay with that cost, right? But that's to say is, like, I think we're already also in the backlash, and that's always something to watch out for.
I think one negative outcome I've seen is when things are in the media, there's a lot of response to it on message boards and whatnot, and it's turned almost into like a hierarchy of what is considered an actual assault, versus harassment, versus 20 years ago, that would have been fine. Why is it an issue now? So kind of people trying to categorize what a person's experience is versus allowing that survivor to tell his or her own story. It's other folks passing judgment, which it has to be so devastating.
I will say that in a short amount of time, when someone, because people used to share on social media about different assaults and things like that, and there was usually just a tremendous pile-on of victim blaming and disbelief. And so in a short amount of time, we now have a sort of a pile-on of support, which I am really happy to see. And that's changed in, like I said, a really short amount of time. How should I comfort a victim who comes to me or turns to me? So, like we mentioned, people are very likely to have someone they care about and who cares about them, come to them first. Like, what do you advise people in terms of, like, saying the right thing?
I think it's not about saying the right thing. I think it's listening. A lot of times the person cannot articulate how they feel or why they're feeling the way they're feeling. Our human nature is to try to figure out the why, and most often they're not going to know the why. But I think just to say that you're there, that you're going to listen, that you care about them, and that you believe them, and that let them guide your actions. So, just offer to be there however you need to be there, whether it's a safe place to go to, a ride to maybe go talk to a therapist, going to a treatment center, whatever that may be, but just to be present and be there and listen.
Good. And sort of they said, why do you fight for people who've been abused before? Kind of what inspired you to end up doing this work? Like, put you guys on the spot.
Well, okay, very quickly, and I told the students who I met with before this, so I apologize, right? Like, am a woman who grew up in the U.S., and so what does that mean about high school and college? It means all my friends, my teachers, people I really loved and cared about were being sexually assaulted, and they were telling me about it and asking me for help. And my approach to it was, I read a lot of self-help literature in college, and I was like, this is useful in a starting place, but these aren't the stories that my friends are telling me. Like, I wanted to honor the individual nature of each of their experiences. And as an anthropologist, I was like, how can I study this in a way that is ethical? Which, doesn't mean that there aren't some kind of tricky situations that I was navigating, but I couldn't think of any other way to do it than as a rape crisis advocate. Right? That was the only ethical space for me in the room. I did not want to be a fly on the wall and an observer, and that's a whole nother skill set, and it's gotten even more, I think, professionalized. So I study this because we need a language to talk about it, and I frequently say things that I think are, not intuitive or make people feel defensive or, feel really critical. I also come from anthropology. We're really hard on ourselves too. And I think that's important because someone has to think about the big picture, because we all live our lives really individually, but thinking again about what are we doing as a group, as a collective, I think I just need to keep telling those stories, and it's gotten more and more complicated. So that's kind of what motivated me. And eventually, prevention again. I'm tired of responding. I will always be there for every survivor who comes to me, every student, but I'm really focused now on what it would mean to prevent sexual violence and sexual harm. And part of that is as a parent. I'm raising a little boy, right? And I don't want him to victimize anybody, and I don't want him to be victimized. And so I think all the time about what is this world that I'm leaving my child.
Okay. Is there a place besides the emergency department? And we've got about 5 questions left. Are you guys? It's time right now. Do you want to? We should stop, right, and let people leave if they want to. I guess we have to stop. If you haven't had your question read yet, we're going to do the next 5, but up here, and then we'll stay around and answer questions. Okay?
And if you could please fill out your yellow evaluation form that was in the program.
Thank you, everyone.
On the